All right, Matthew 27, that's where we're at. We got a chapter and a half left in Matthew. We're not going to tell you where we're going next. We've been asking people, we've been surveying, what book do you think the pastors should preach through next? Guess which one? Every time. That's why we don't ask the congregation. Starts with an R. You guys just hit two of them. Chapter 27 of Matthew. I better get there too. Line by line, verse by verse. If you're visiting the door, that's how we've been doing it. We're going to take 15 to 26. Verse 15 to 26 today. Now at the feast of the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I've suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified." And he then said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." We'll just kind of stop there right now. So the slightest recap, I think you heard Chad preach on this last week. We actually have it up in verse 11, is Jesus is arrested. He's brought before the governor, who is Pilate. And Pilate, as we can see here, he's kind of, I don't want to say soft towards Jesus, but he's sympathetic. Like he thinks there's a raw deal going on and that Jesus is on the bad end of the stick. Now, I do want you to know this, because it can look like from narratives like this that Pilate was a good dude. But if you go back and you look at history and you look at Pilate and you look at the stuff that he did, he was not a good dude. He was just like the rest of them. But we can see that he is sympathetic here from where he's sitting and what he's watched as far as the treatment of the Jewish leaders on Jesus. And so when he first comes before Pilate in 11, Pilate's basically trying to get Jesus off the hook. That's what he's trying to get himself already and Jesus out of this. And so one of the first questions that he asks Jesus is, are you the king of the Jews? Right? Like, and what he's hoping is that Jesus will just recant at this point and go, you know what? No. You know what I mean? And then he'll be able to cycle him back out that way. But Jesus doesn't, does he? He doubles down and he says, you say so. Yeah, it's true. Like, yes. He doubles down on it, right? And then Jesus goes what? Silent. He stops talking after that. So then Pilate has to like activate plan B, which is like, I know what I'll do. I'll put him on the annual prisoner release program that we do every year and hope that the crowd does the right thing. Since Jesus isn't recanting, hopefully the crowd will get him out of this. And so that brings us to where we're at here. Okay, this is kind of like plan B for Pilate. And so in 15 and 16, we see that at the feast of the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, accustomed. It says, right? So it was like a Roman tradition to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And I don't know what you think. I just think this is a bad idea. I think this is a weird tradition. I think that when I was young, when I was a teenager, I would have thought something like this was cool. Like, this is so rad that they do something like this, that once a year they take two bad dudes and they just let one just assimilate back into society. You know what I mean? Like, that's fantastic. But now that I'm an adult and I've had kids and I have grandkids and I've lived in society a little, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea. Like, could you imagine, like, every year if at, like, Thanksgiving, like, they're like, hey, come up to the penitentiary in Madras. We're going to let one of two dudes go. It's just like, no. I'm pretty sure that both those guys, no matter which one it is, are supposed to be there. They're supposed to be in there. They're in there for a reason, right? And so this just seems like this is a weird tradition, but it's something that they did annually, apparently. I'm sure it was entertaining for the people that were there. And in this case, the person on one side of Pilate, on one side of the governor, is a man named Jesus, and the one on the other is a man named Barabbas. So we need to talk about Barabbas for a second. One of the primary points of interest with this guy is the type of criminal, the kind of criminal that Barabbas was. I think that a lot of times we get this wrong. I think as Westerners that don't have a lot of Jewish background and historic, like a broad historic understanding of what things were like at that time back then, we can just look at narratives like this, the simplicity of the English and the language, and go, okay, the bottom line is this is just a really bad dude. He's like the opposite of Jesus, right? So he's like a thug, but Matthew uses the word notorious here, okay? Like the guy was well known for something. And that notorious is the adjective that Matthew uses to describe the kind of criminal he was. Praise God, we have some synoptic gospels that help fill in blanks sometimes on some of this, right? Mark's gospel says this in Mark 15:7. Among the rebels, first tip right there, rebels, in prison, who had committed murder in the insurrection. It's a definite event. In the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. Luke says in Luke 23, they all cried out, away with this man, Jesus, and released to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. The word in the Greek for someone who's just a base level like criminal, thief, robber, whatever, is kleptos. Kleptos sounds like what? Klepto. It's like, or kleptomaniac. It's where we actually get that. That would be kind of a base level like criminal or thief or robber. The other word that the Greek uses for a criminal or a robber is lestis. And lestis means a revolutionary, like an insurrectionist. That's why Mark and Luke choose to translate it that way and use that word. In other words, it's someone who leads a movement. It's a rebel, or someone who leads a revolt. And we had a large group of people in Jesus' day at that time in Jerusalem that went by the name of zealot. Zealots. Basically, that's what we have here in Barabbas. Is he wasn't just a thug with no morals and no convictions, wreaking havoc on his neighbor. He was actually a zealot for the Jewish people that was coming against, that was opposing Rome. And we're going to need this as we move through this story. This is important information. The point is that Barabbas wasn't just some low-life loser that was nothing but a menace to society. He was a zealot. He was an activist for Israel. And what exactly might he have done in this case? Like, what might have been the definite article, as far as Matthew or Mark says, as if everyone would have known what insurrection he was talking about? What might that have been that he was arrested in and that he killed a man? We're not for certain. But there is legend out there, if you go into church history and you read some of the early church fathers, that tend to think that this was about a point where Herod allowed Rome to put their seal, to put their eagle above the temple gates. And if you're a zealot, like if you're a Jewish zealot and you're already against Rome and you're not getting down with the fact that Rome occupies your people, you're going to have a problem with that. That's going to push somebody over a line. And so it's said, legend-wise, that this was that insurrection that took place, that he had had enough of Herod selling out to Rome. And there was no way that the Jewish people, the commoner, was going to sit there and look at the seal of Rome over the top of the temple gates. I don't know if that's true. It's a legend, okay? It was probably something like that. But whatever it might have been over exactly, it was something that's much more serious against the state, against the government, than just a common criminal would have been against his neighbor, okay? This makes sense because they also didn't tend to order or issue crucifixion for common criminals. Even if you committed murder, didn't mean that you automatically got crucifixion. Crucifixion was reserved for something really, really, really special. So yeah, they had the death penalty, but it didn't mean it looked like a cross when you went there. If you were just a normal thief or robber, they'd probably cut off your hand, because that's the kind of stuff that they would do back then, and let you go, or you'd do some prison time, but you wouldn't necessarily go to the cross. That was reserved for capital crime against the state. Like they didn't just run around crucifying people. You may say, well then what about the thief on the cross? Well, I'm glad you asked. There were two of them. Lestus, not Cleptus. Think about that for a second. Who were these guys on each side of Jesus when he hung there? Likely two guys that were with Barabbas in the insurrection. Probably what they were doing. Now, we're reading a lot into this, but it is Lestus with those thieves, not Cleptus. Zealots, activists, people that lead or participate in insurrections. Interesting, okay? So hopefully this helps to give us a little bit more clarity about the guy Barabbas and what he was doing there. Verses 17 through 19 says, so when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife, there's the wives, sent word to him, saying, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. So here's what we have. Both Pilate right now and his wife are not feeling it. They're not getting down with what they find themselves in the middle of right here. They're not at all keen on being any part of the plot that's going down against Jesus. So Pilate here is still, he's thinking this is his ticket out, like we said, like put him through the prisoner release program, right? I'll get him off my plate that way. The people will do the right thing. His wife seconds this. Yes, we need to get Jesus off of our plate, but for another reason. Because apparently God personally paid her a visit or something like that day in a dream. Something happened that she can't shake. Something has made and left a serious impression, a convicting impression on her. And again, we're not sure what exactly this was or what exactly happened, because like what it says here about Pilate, this little statement about Pilate's wife, this is the only place we find it in the scriptures. It's not in any of the other gospels. Matthew's the only one who mentions this little weird thing, which kind of stinks. Because when I have a little weird thing, I want to know what it is. I want to know what happened. But this is all we have about this, okay? We don't know. All we know is that whatever this thing was in this dream, it's haunting her. Like it was serious. All right? It was troubling enough for her to send to her husband, to tell her husband, you need to get out of this thing. You need to have nothing to do with Jesus. So both of them, for different reasons, are on the same page concerning Jesus. Bottom line, they both basically cast their vote for Team Jesus. But they would be the only ones that would, it seems, that day. By the way, it's interesting that these two people that are wanting to see Jesus off the hook are both Romans. They're both outsiders. They're not inside. They're not Jews. They're not his countrymen. They're not his brothers, right? They're outsiders. Interesting. But of course, we know that the sympathy of Pilate and we know that the sympathy of his wife is not enough to change the plan. It's not enough to change the plan. They do not get their way because this is the plan. And whose plan is it? Say it. God's. This is God's plan. There's no plan B. There's no plan C. There's no like, oh my goodness, if man comes and does this and messes this up and meddles in this, then I'm going to have to go that way and then I got to adjust this way. God doesn't do that. God has a plan. And as bad as this looks, and as dark as this looks, and as wrong as this looks, we need to remember while we read our Bibles that it's God's plan. It's God's plan. We need to remember sections of Scripture like Acts 4, 27 and 28. I read it a few weeks ago. This is where Peter and John come back from getting beat and threatened by the authorities for sharing the gospel, and they come back to the church, and they're sitting probably in a room like this with a bunch of people like this, and they break into prayer. Peter breaks into prayer to God, and he says this, "For truly in the city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and plan predestined to take place." That's a strong statement. And Peter seems pretty convinced and certain of it, doesn't he? Like why things happened the way they happened. Who does he credit? Who does he know? Pulled every string and worked out every detail and every layer of that historical nightmare. It's God. So it's interesting to think that even with all the power that Pilate had at that time, in the position he was in with Rome, and his wife, I think she was like the granddaughter of the Caesar at the time, okay? Like even with all of the power and the influence that they were able to exercise in Roman-occupied Israel, they still couldn't stop it. They still couldn't reverse it. They still couldn't change the outcome. They voted for Jesus to be released, but what do Jesus' countrymen do, right? Verses 20 to 23. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas. I always want to say Barnabas. If I do that and just skip by it without that's going to maybe be normal. Give me grace. All right. The chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. 21, the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So the popular vote wins, okay? There is no electoral college back in this day and this system and this place, right? It's just popular vote, and it seems that everybody present was unanimous in throwing Jesus under the bus, in spite of Pilate's sympathetic words and actions and attempts. And by the way, I do not believe that the chief priests and the elders needed to do much persuading of the crowd to reject Jesus, and we'll come back to this. I do believe they were probably walking around going, "Vote for Barabbas to be released, Barabbas released." I don't think there was any debates going on between them, like convincing. Okay? We'll come back to this. So "let him be crucified" is the shout, as if they seem non-responsive to Pilate's question, what evil has he done? You do notice that, right? Like Pilate in the middle of this asks, I don't know, kind of an important question. He wants a little bit of clarification of the justification for this guy being released rather than this guy being released. Right? Like what evil has he done? Give me a reason why. At least something. Throw me something. And they don't seem to care at all about what evil Jesus has actually done. They just know that they want Barabbas instead of Jesus. They don't answer it. They just ignore the question. All we know, give us Barabbas, right? And by this point, things have reached such a fever pitch of intensity and emotion that Pilate has to fold. He finally has to fold, right? We see this in 24. We'll just read 24 to 26. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and he washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and our children." And then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. He washed his hands. I love this in a way. Like this is kind of this is kind of a cool picture. Like, okay, you did this, not me. And he doesn't just say it to him, he demonstrates it. He has a bowl of water brought to him, and he sticks his hands in there, and he washes his hands. And that's so cool in a way, but and I'm thinking wouldn't that be nice if that's the way it worked? You know what I mean? That'd be kind of cool if we could just wash our hands and presto, be clean of that thing that we just did. That would be pretty convenient, wouldn't it? You know? Of course, the challenge is that as cool as this picture might be, this demonstration that Pilate does, there is no such thing as washing your hands with Jesus. You can't do it. You can't do it. You cannot come clean, be clean with Jesus by simply washing your hands and saying, I'm innocent. Or I'm unaffiliated. Right? Like the only way that we can come clean with Jesus is by having our hearts washed, not our hands. Right? We need to be all in when it comes to Him. There is no neutral position when it comes to the Christ. There is no passive position when it comes to the Christ. There is no indifference when it comes to the Christ. It's an impossibility to go, oh, I can take it or leave it when it comes to Jesus. I've known these people. You probably know these people. There's times I've got to witness to certain people, like get in there and start talking about Jesus, and you come across every once in a while someone who's indifferent. That's just like, oh yeah, Jesus, yeah, he lived and he was a good dude, and yeah, I can get down with that. But they're actually not down with that. Like they're passive about it. And I don't know what to do with that. If someone's aggressive, right, or opposes Christ, or has challenges with Christ, or has doubt with Christ, or like I know how to approach that. I know how to witness to that person and like where to go with that. But when someone's like, could take it or leave it, yeah, like I guess I don't think I know what to do with that because it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as standing on the line when it comes to Christ. We must all do something with Jesus. Every one of us, personally. We receive Him or reject Him, but we cannot recline with Him. No line to step on when it comes to Jesus, just over. That's it. We must all be all in with who He is and what He did, or we're all out. That's the way it works. And that's what's interesting about Pilate. I don't know what actually ended up happening with this guy. I don't know. I think we're going to be surprised in a lot of ways with who we see when we get home. I don't know. I'd like to be hopeful with all these guys. Same with Barabbas. We don't have the rest of the story. There's been it's funny while I was studying this week, how many movies have been made about Barabbas. Blows my mind. I was like, it's this little blip in here. You know what I mean? It's a few lines in our Bibles, and that's it. And there's been all these movies made, and most of them end with he ends up getting saved. I hope so. That'd be kind of cool. There's a few ironies here in this story, because you're done already. Almost. There's a few ironies here in this story that are worth mentioning to wrap this up, to close this up, okay? Number one, this guy's name. Barabbas. I spoke about what type of criminal he was, but not really about his name. Bar, son of Abba. Abbas. The father or a father. Son of the father. Well, what's so interesting about that? Well, it's interesting because it just happens to be the same title as the guy standing on the other side of Pilate. What a coincidence. It's almost like there's some kind of identity theft going on here, you know? In fact, if you talk to a Muslim, they actually believe so. They actually take that all the way down the rabbit hole. That maybe the explanation for Jesus being seen and living and walking and breathing and eating by so many people after his death was because they took the wrong Jesus to the cross. They'll do this because the name is real. Like Son of the Father, Son of the Father. In fact, it gets a little weird in that. You ready for it to get weirder? Okay, cool. In some of the earliest manuscripts that we have of the Gospel of Matthew, Barabbas actually is given a first name. You know what it is? Yeshua. Yeshua. Which, of course, we pronounce, or Joshua, Jesus or Joshua, right? Just like the name of the man standing on the other side of Pilate. Okay? Now, someone will say, well, if that's true, then how come it doesn't show up in our Bibles? Glad you asked. Some of the early church fathers, you've heard of Origen, right, as an example? say that it became standard to omit Barabbas' first name in the earliest copies of Matthew because at that point the name Jesus was already considered sacred to the church. Like only Jesus gets Jesus, okay? So they just thought, we're not really killing anything or losing anything. We're just not going to give it to Barabbas. Some people say there's nothing to this. Other people say there is. Go home, have fun. I don't know. I'm not going to stand on either side of it. Either way, whether you add in the first name or not, we still don't just have a notorious prisoner standing up here with Jesus before this crowd hoping to be released. We have a distraction. A type of counterfeit even, in that one is the actual Son of the Father and one is not. In other words, we have one who is on several levels a type of Messiah for the people and one who actually is the Messiah for the people. And one of the ways Barabbas is a type of Messiah to the people was due to the fact that he was a revolutionary for the people, a zealot, an insurrectionist, an activist. In other words, a deliverer of sorts to the people. See, what's really going on here is that these people that day are having to choose between two different Jesuses as far as which one they want released, or two other messiahs, if you will, or two deliverers, if you will. That's what the crowd's faced with here. One preaching repentance and salvation through believing in him, the other preaching a salvation through being a political, patriotic, nationalistic activist that's trying to get things done for the Jewish people now, in that moment. This is the deception of it all for the crowd, isn't it? And I'm afraid that it's a great deception today for a lot of us. They had someone in front of them who was doing stuff against Rome and someone who wasn't. You had someone who was active now as if he could maybe make Israel great again right then, and then someone who was seemingly passive, who was too peaceful, who was too meek, who was too lawful, who was too patient, and now who was too quiet. Must not be him. This guy's kicking back against Rome. This dude acts like he doesn't care. He's soft. Must be this guy. Guess where the vote gets placed? Guess what the cry becomes? Guess where the allegiance goes? Guess who the deliverer looks like to the crowd in that moment, right? The Son of the Father, Barabbas, not the Son of the Father, the Christ. The Christ. And try not to hate me. Listen, I feel like this is my responsibility right now in the moment that we live in, more than ever as a pastor to the church, because so many Christians have been deceived by throwing themselves and their identity and their hope into politics and the political system. And they have their place. And they are a real thing that we all have to deal with in our lives. But that is not your identity if you belong to Christ. That's the reason that I'm going to harp on this and why I'm going to keep harping on it all the way until we crawl up to November. Because we're all just going to keep becoming more and more infested and immersed in something that God's already dealt with, that God already has a plan for. Barabbas was perceived and endorsed as the hope of Israel in that historic moment, in that political moment, while the real deliverer was casted aside, discarded, rejected, missed. This is one of the many reasons why we, and I do mean we collectively, pastorally, do not and will not openly champion or campaign from the pulpit for any particular party or candidate. It's not because we're soft. It's not because we're woke. It's not because we don't have any political convictions, but because we have greater ones. We have greater convictions. Greater convictions, greater concerns, greater things to speak of, which by the grace of God will lead us to a greater reach. The pastors here are not ashamed of or void of any actual thoughts or opinions when it comes to the country that we live in, but we are terrified of ever encouraging you to look to or to hold to or to promote or to put your hope in something or someone other than the Christ and his kingdom. Our allegiance as Christians is not to the donkey or the elephant. It's to the Lamb. That is my party. That's my convention. That's where my allegiance is. That's how I'm registered through the body and blood of the Lamb. There is an irony in that both these guys were messiahs, quote unquote, to the people in their own ways. And you know what? Because this crowd got too caught up in their political moment, they chose the wrong guy. Think about this. And I'm not talking about two human candidates here. They chose the wrong guy. I'm not saying don't vote. You need to vote. Vote your conviction. Just don't make it your identity. You have a greater one. You want to be an evangelist? Be one for the Lamb, not the man of the moment. You want to stand for something good in this world that brings actual change? Stand for the Christ. For the Christ. Okay, irony number 2. In verse 25, we have a statement by the people that is cringeworthy. I think I cringed a little bit every time I read it this week. And yet it holds a profound irony, and that is this. The people shout, his blood be on us and our children. The way they shouted this, the way they meant this, the context in which they spoke this is probably one of the worst responses they could possibly have made. It's probably one of the worst things they possibly could have said. And yet, at the same time, it is precisely what they and their children need. Do you see that? It is precisely what they need. The blood of Christ to be upon them. The blood of Christ to be upon them. The good news for this crowd, as well as for us here today, is that due to and only by the grace of God, he is going to apply the blood of Christ to them in a way far better than a way that they meant it. God's going to do that. They are meaning their statement and their words against Jesus for evil, but Jesus means it toward them for good. Sound familiar? Sound like a guy named Joseph with some brothers who did a bad deal? Sure does, doesn't it? You know why? Because that's the gospel way back there in Genesis. It's all over and over again, over and over again. It's exactly what this is. These people are saying this out of hate and maliciousness for evil. And God's going to take every drop of the blood of Christ and apply it to their good. All right, final irony. Let's close. This is a pretty obvious one. You guys are quiet today. What's up? This is not really an irony, I guess. You and I not only can identify as one of those that were in the crowd that day, we're definitely Barabbas in this story. We are Barabbas. If there was ever a story that exemplifies and simplifies our guilt and God's goodness, it's this one. That such an injustice becomes such good news is what we have in front of us here in this story, because one of those two guys present that day did deserve the cross, but it wasn't the one who ended up going to it. It's quite the powerful gospel picture, isn't it? We have two guys, one falsely convicted, one rightly convicted, one innocent, one guilty. The innocent paying the price so that the guilty may walk free. This is the gospel. This is the simplicity and the power of the gospel, and this is what we preach. Christ and Christ crucified. Octavius Winslow said, "Who delivered up Jesus to die? Not Judas for money, not Pilate for fear, not the Jews for envy, but the Father for love." And that's what we have in this story. And I praise God that we have that here. I praise God that we have the rest of the story. Because it seems like everything's gone dark at this point in Matthew. We're in some dark stuff for a couple weeks. But do not lose sight of the fact that God is using every little piece of that darkness for our good. Like the sun's going to come out. The sun's going to come out. And it's going to come out in a far brighter way than you and I could have imagined, because God's perfect plan and purpose is perfect. Lord, thank you that your Son was obedient in the moment to all struggles, anxieties, challenges for the sake of us. Thank you that you, without a doubt, are faithful, even when we are not. We thank you for taking every bit of our disgusting evil and sinful intentions against you and meaning them for good. Amen.